In this film, psychologists discuss recent research which investigates the biological basis of intelligence. They consider which regions in the brain are involved in intelligence, the way in which brain development influences performance on IQ tests, and how exposure to toxic substances which affect the nervous system can impact on reasoning ability. Recent developments in the exploration of the link between intelligence and the brain has been made possible by advances in technology and the emergence of new brain imaging techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging or fMRI scanners. These scanners have enabled researchers to examine in real time what happens in the brain when individuals perform tasks on an IQ test.
During the 1990s, we had begun to do these experiments with brain damage patients to confirm a link between frontal lobe functions and fluid intelligence. But when functional MRI was invented, the opportunity came along to do this in a whole new way. That is, to ask what regions of the brain became active when people carried out fluid intelligence tests.
John Duncan is heading a team at Cambridge University's Cognition and Brain Sciences unit. The team are attempting to map the regions of the brain involved in fluid intelligence. This is the type of intelligence that includes abilities like logical thinking and problem solving, and which are believed to be independent of acquired knowledge.
Within the particular context of fluid and crystallized, this is an idea that goes back to a psychologist, Cattell, in the 1960s, and that was that you must distinguish current cognitive processing, if you like, from all that knowledge that you have built up in your lifetime. And both of these are traditionally used in intelligence testing. So to test current processing, you often use novel problem solving, getting people to solve problems they never solved before, and trying to keep the knowledge that you need very basic, so you can assume everybody knows what triangles and squares and so on are, but they've got to put this together in a new way.
Hi Sharon, can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Okay, so we're going to start with the Cattell task, with the odd one out questions.
Right.
Daniel Mitchell is part of the team working with John Duncan.
You choose the one image that's odd one out on each trial and press the corresponding button.
Okay.
There'll be some easy ones and there'll be blocks of hard ones. The important thing is that for the hard blocks, don't guess, but puzzle over it as long as you can until you're sure you know what the answer is.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
In the study, participants are placed in an fMRI scanner and are asked to perform non-verbal tests designed specifically to measure fluid intelligence. This enables the researchers to monitor what happens in the brain while they're performing the tasks.
We're presenting these stimuli to Sharon, and it's an odd one out task. They're based on the Cattell test, so the sort of questions that you would be presented with when you're measuring fluid intelligence. So there's a set of difficult problems and there's a set of easy problems. And Sharon is alternately spending 30 seconds doing the hard problems and then 30 seconds doing the easy problems. So on this screen we can see which button the volunteer is pressing. So there they press the third button to indicate they think the third item is the odd one out. And then at the end, we'll compare the brain activity when she's performing the hard problems to when she's performing the simple problems. And that will show us the regions that are activated by these types of problem-solving questions that are commonly used to measure fluid intelligence.
Participants taking part in the study perform a whole range of fluid intelligence tasks while in the scanner. What the team have discovered is that regardless of the precise nature of the task, regions in the front of the brain, in what is called the frontal lobe, get activated. Also, the more difficult the task, the greater the activation in those regions.
An interesting picture builds up. There's a very specific network of regions on the lateral surface of the frontal lobe, in the medial surface, as it's called, between the two cerebral hemispheres, and also back in the parietal lobe, that seems to be selectively activated or recruited when intelligence tests are performed.
So the findings suggest that performance on fluid intelligence tests is linked to activity in a specific system in the frontal lobes. John Duncan calls this the multiple demand network and describes it as a general-purpose region which is involved in solving challenging reasoning tasks.
Lit up are the main regions of John's multiple demand network. So here at the back, on both sides, we've got the intraparietal sulcus, and there as well. At the front of the brain in the frontal lobes, we've got some activity on the lateral frontal surface and on the midline. If I take it through to this side, we can see that the activity just sneaks there into the anterior insula as well, which is another region of the multiple demand network. This activity at the back and lower down is in occipital cortex, which deals with vision. So this may or may not be an important part of the multiple demand network. It could also be a consequence of the fact that we're using visual stimuli.
When they compared scans obtained from different participants, the team realised that the amount of activity in these regions varied depending on the individual's performances in fluid intelligence tests. The usual pattern was that the better the performance, the more activity there was in the relevant regions.
Implying that the neurophysiological functions are a really core of our intelligence, that it's something we use no matter what type of problem we're trying to solve. And at this stage, we're very early on in trying to understand neurophysiologically how the neurons in this network pull off the complex functions that we do. But I think we already have enough clues from what I've said to be pretty sure this is a core critical question of understanding how our brains work.
While this kind of research is still at the early stages, John Duncan believes that mapping the regions of the brain involved in intelligence might, in the future, have practical applications, such as helping to inform the diagnosis and treatment of cognitive impairment. Researchers interested in the link between the brain and intelligence have also considered how intelligence changes over an individual's lifetime, and specifically how it develops in adolescence.
To understand about the mind and the origins of the mind, you need to understand about the function of the brain, about the development of the brain, and how that is constrained, and therefore you need to understand about the early phases of development and the genetic influences on brain development, and then the importance of the environment in shaping both the development we see across the species, but also the variations we see between individuals within the species.
Michael Thomas is director of the Centre for Educational Neuroscience, which is a collaboration between 3 London universities. He is part of a team that has been looking at the development of intelligence in teenage brains. Using verbal and non-verbal intelligence tests, the team set out to test the IQ levels in a group of teenagers over a 4-year period.
It had been held that IQ didn't really vary across the teenage years, that pretty well it was stable by age 10. And when we observed that intelligence was varying across the teenage years, and if you look at either verbal or non-verbal intelligence, the variations were up to 20 IQ points over a 4-year period in the teenage years. Those are quite substantial changes.
The teenagers were tested twice, at the beginning and at the end of the 4 years, and the variations showed both increases and decreases in scores on IQ tests. Researchers also used scanning technology to see whether the changes in the IQ scores were accompanied by changes in the structure of the brain.
By looking at the brain data, we were able to observe local changes in grey matter density that correlated with these changes in intelligence. Now that does 2 things for you. First of all, it just tells you your changes in intelligence across the teenage years are real. They're not a measurement artifact. Secondly, which areas have changed? That may suggest to us some clues about what the brain basis of intelligence is, or in our case, the brain basis of verbal versus non-verbal intelligence.
The finding that IQ is not stable across the teenage years opens the possibility that intellectual potential may improve in adolescence, but also that early achievers may not maintain their potential. This has implications for education policy and cautions against using IQ-based tests for school admissions and decisions about streaming at an early age.
Not everything is set in stone by the beginning of the teenage years. There's still things to play for, abilities may change, and therefore decisions about what pathways you follow should still be flexible across the teenage years. So there shouldn't be an early commitment, as it were. If you want to be more detailed about exactly what should teenagers be studying, what kind of skills, what kind of classes should they be attending. To make those more detailed predictions, you really need to have a mechanistic understanding of what's going on in the system that's producing these changes.
More research is needed before fuller explanations can be offered as to why teenage brains change. However, there is already a range of possibilities.
I'm not sure from the data we have we can be definitive about what the cause is. So I can give you at least two options. One is that this is kind of genetic, right? So you are looking at the unfolding of a potential that has been latent all along, that only manifests, becomes apparent in the teenage years. Or at the other end of the spectrum, it could be an environmental effect. But until we have answers about exactly the causes of the behavior, we can't be very prescriptive about what we would say for educational policy.
The possibility that changes in IQ in adolescence may be the result of environmental factors is consistent with the well-documented finding that things like education, socioeconomic status, or parental involvement in learning can influence the development of intelligence. Less, however, is known about how other kinds of environmental factors, such as toxins in the environment, can affect individuals' cognitive functioning. But this is a growing and important area of psychological research.
I've become very interested in neurotoxicology, and this is an area where I get referred patients who have been exposed to some sort of substance, usually through occupation, and who are reporting ill health which they believe is attributed to exposure to that substance. So, for example, I've been seeing large numbers of agricultural workers who've been exposed to pesticides, and they've reported sort of chronic ill health.
Back in the 1990s, Sarah Mackenzie Ross became interested in health problems many farmers were reporting after being exposed to organophosphates, the chemical used in sheep dip and crop pesticides. Funded by the Department of the Environment, Sarah Mackenzie Ross set up a 4-year study to track the cognitive functioning of farmers who had been exposed. And to do this, she used intelligence tests.
We used a very broad battery of tests, but they were all tests that are routinely used in clinical practice. So we used the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, we used Wechsler Memory Scale, we used tests of reaction time, tests of fine motor control. We also ran interviews, structured interviews that are used in the NHS to diagnose mood disorder. So in all, our battery was pretty much a whole day's worth of testing for a farmer. So having administered these tests, we found that the farmers showed evidence of cognitive impairment, but not in all areas. So whilst their sort of perceptual skills and their language skills were relatively well intact, they were showing problems on tests of response speed, on tests of working memory, on tests of verbal memory, and on tests associated with frontal lobe function. So they were quite impaired in those areas.
The findings from this study led to further research with other groups at risk of exposure.
We were quickly contacted by another occupational group who felt that they were being exposed to organophosphates in their workplace, and they were airline pilots who reported that occasionally in aircraft there would be some sort of fault in the engine that would allow fumes to enter the cabin, and that one of the products in the fumes was an organophosphate. So they were struggling to retain information from air traffic control, and they were struggling to do things as quickly and efficiently as they were before. And they were absolutely convinced it was due to exposure to contaminated air. So they asked us if we would have a look at a group of airline pilots to see whether they showed similar problems to the farmers. And we put them through a very similar battery of tests that we'd used before, and we discovered that the pattern of deficits in the pilots was very similar and mapped on nicely to the pattern of deficits that we'd observed in farmers.
Sarah Mackenzie Ross's study has found that environmental toxins which affect the nervous system can lead to a deterioration in cognitive functioning. These findings have in turn led to recommendations to government and have helped modify health and safety policies around the use and handling of organophosphates in the agricultural industry. All the research studies seen in this film are helping move forward understandings of the biological basis of intelligence, how it develops across a lifetime, and the different factors that influence an individual's cognitive abilities. Further advances in brain imaging technology will create the opportunities in the future for more detailed research in these areas. The tougher challenge will be to see whether the study of the brain will be able to shed more light on what intelligence actually is and how it impacts on people's lives.